Some of the most fun comedy novels of recent times have been written by Jonas Jonasson. He's a Swedish author and he writes in his native language. But thankfully, all his books have been translated into English and various other languages. So it's really interesting to read his books. And especially the first book which he wrote. It was called The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Out of the Window and Disappeared, which pretty much sums up what the book is about. The story of a 100-year-old man who climbs out of the window and disappears, and the story includes some of his adventures and the kind of life he has lived in the past 100 years. So it keeps going back and forth in present and past, and the story covers some really interesting events of the 20th century. And then there is a sequel to that book. It's called The Accidental Further Adventures of the 100-Year-Old Man. So now the story moves on in present day and age and talks about the kind of politics, the kind of world events that have been happening around us. The book came out in 2018, right in the middle of what we can call the Trump age, which seems to be in its final days at the moment. But whatever your political inclination, it's always a good idea to poke some humor, poke some fun at these political figures and laugh about it. So I'm going to read some passages from this book where he's describing Donald Trump and some of his actions. It's a nice combination of some real life events and in between some fiction. Let's see. Let's start the passage. Donald John Trump was born in New York on 14 June 1946, a year to the day after Swedish citizen Alan Carlson solved the last problem facing the United States in the struggle to create the atomic bomb. Alan and Donald had more in common than one might at first think. For example, both had received inheritances from their parents. Alan had taken over a cottage with no insulation or running water somewhere in the forest outside the swampland village of Malmkoppen, while young Donald's father had left him 27,000 centrally located apartments in New York City. Subsequently, things went equally poorly for the sons. Alan accidentally blew his cottage sky high and as a result became homeless. Donald did more or less the same thing with his father's business empire and was only rescued from bankruptcy by the help of a number of benevolent banks. Another common denominator was that Donald and Alan had sat around sighing over their existences at more or less the same time but on opposite sides of the globe. Alan on Bali before he was bewitched by a black tablet and let himself be carried off by a hot air balloon. Donald in a big White House in Washington, surrounded by idiots and malevolent characters. It wasn't as pleasant to be President of the United States as Donald Trump had expected. Firing people was just about the most fun thing in the world. When he did it in the business world and on TV, he was met with fear and respect. But as soon as he set a head or two rolling in the White House, or 13, it sort of depended on how you counted them, the corrupt media insinuated that he was mentally unstable. Another horrible experience was that the Republicans, his Republicans, didn't do as he said, and that apparently the law was written in such a way that he couldn't fire them too. And all this goddamn talk of racism, like how his father Fred and had allegedly been arrested at a KKK march in Queens at some point back in the beginning of time. For one thing, it had never happened. For another, he was released right away. So what was the big deal? Worst of all, you could no longer tell the truth in the country. Not if you were the president. Like saying Mexicans were rapists and Muslims were something even worse. Every last one. There were bright spots too, of course. After all, the president had a lot of say. He could start wars if the necessity arose, real ones and verbal ones. His war against the fake media was ongoing. Donald Trump praised himself for having invented the word fake on his own. Anyone who invents new words can make them mean whatever he wants. In practice, it meant that fake news was anything Trump didn't like reading, listening to, or watching. But it was trickier with the real wars. Heads of state in other countries turned out to be as difficult to remove from office as any given House member or senator. The best remaining option was to threaten to bomb the shit out of them. This tactic worked in the business world if you switched out the word bomb for sue. But when your opponent was a pint-sized, narcissistic madman with the capacity for nuclear weapons, you really had to think twice. This wasn't exactly one of Donald Trump's strong suits. He had to admit that to himself. His time was far too precious for it, and also, the North Korean narcissist reminded him of someone. He just couldn't think who it was. Anyway, Trump knew he had half the country on his side, as long as he played his cards right, since the other half was beyond salvation. It was mobilizing his own people that counted. Talking about new gun laws would, for example, be a bad strategy. Donald Trump had always taken care of his friends, especially the ones who couldn't be fired. Like the gun lobby, for example. It was a nuisance that a psychopath had just killed 60 or so people in Las Vegas with the help of 23 different guns. According to Murphy's Law, he would probably also have a school shooting on his hands soon. Furthermore, the president had to continue to remind the country of all the external threats they faced, aside from the mass shootings that was. To be on the safe side, he added a few on his own. Everyone on his elite squad, of course, had to be on board with building a wall to block the country that consisted solely of rapists. War was also a good mobilizing factor. He won his ongoing Twitter war just about every day. That left the other one, the one against the tiny rocket man, the narcissist. Who did he remind him of?